The highway stretched endlessly before me, swallowed by darkness on both sides. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and the last gas station I'd passed was a crumbling relic that looked like it hadn't served customers since the Reagan administration. I'm Marcus Chen, a documentary photographer from Seattle, and I'd driven 8 hours into rural Missouri chasing rumors of an authentic harvest festival untouched by modern commercialism. What I found instead would make me question everything I thought I knew about small-town America. Before we dive into what happened in that forgotten corner of the Midwest, if you're fascinated by true stories from America's hidden communities, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories don't make the evening news, but they're happening in towns you've probably driven through without a second thought. And smash that like button if you're ready for stories that will make you think twice before taking that scenic back road detour. The town of Millbrook appeared suddenly, almost reluctantly, as if the mist itself had been hiding it. Population 342, according to a weathered sign that leaned at a precarious angle. The main street consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings, their facades frozen in an architectural time capsule from the 1950s. But what struck me immediately, what sent the first whisper of unease down my spine, was the absolute stillness. No cars moved, no pedestrians walked. Every window I passed reflected only darkness back at me. I parked outside what appeared to be the only operational business, a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, Maggie's. The fluorescent lights inside cast a sickly yellow glow across empty booths and a counter where a single waitress stood, motionless, watching me through the glass. Even from outside, I could see the tension in her posture, the way her eyes tracked my every movement as I approached the door. The bell above the entrance gave a harsh jangle that seemed obscenely loud in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, hung in the air. The waitress, whose name tag identified her as Beth, was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with the kind of worn exhaustion that spoke of hard living in a hard place. "We're about to close," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. I checked my watch. It was barely 7 in the evening. "I'm just looking for some information about the Harvest Festival," I said, keeping my tone friendly, non-threatening. "I heard it's happening this weekend." The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes widened fractionally, and she glanced toward the kitchen door as if checking whether someone was listening. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "You need to leave, right now. Get back in your car and drive until you hit the interstate. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just go." I've interviewed war refugees, documented human trafficking survivors, photographed gang territories in Central America. I know genuine fear when I see it, and this woman was terrified. "What's wrong?" I asked. "What happens at the festival?" She shook her head violently, backing away from the counter. "They'll know you're here. They probably already know. Outsiders aren't welcome during the harvest. It's not safe. It's never been safe for people like you." The kitchen door swung open, and a man emerged. Large, probably mid-50s, with the kind of build that comes from a lifetime of physical labor. His eyes moved from Beth to me, and his expression hardened into something cold and evaluating. "This gentleman was just leaving," Beth said quickly, her voice now steady but strained. Wrong turn off the highway." The man said nothing. He simply stared at me with an intensity that felt almost physical, like a hand pressing against my chest, pushing me toward the door. I've been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when discretion is the better part of valor. I nodded, thanked Beth, and walked back to my car, feeling his gaze bore into my back with every step. But I didn't leave. I'm not proud of what happened next, but curiosity has always been both my greatest asset and my most dangerous liability. Instead of heading for the interstate, I parked on a side street 3 blocks away, killed my lights, and waited. If there was a story here, if something truly wrong was happening in this forgotten town, I had a responsibility to document it. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that Beth's fear had ignited something in me, a need to understand, to expose, to reveal. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. The town remained dead, lifeless, a movie set waiting for actors who never appeared. I was beginning to think I'd overreacted, that Beth's warning had been about nothing more than insular small-town xenophobia when I heard it. Singing. Faint at first, carried on the night breeze, a melody that was simultaneously familiar and alien. Children's voices, I thought initially, but as it grew louder, I realized the pitch was wrong, the harmony too complex, too deliberately discordant. It was coming from somewhere beyond the main street, from the fields that surrounded the town. I grabbed my camera and followed the sound. The singing led me down a dirt road that cut between harvested cornfields, the stubble creating jagged shadows in the moonlight. About half a mile from town, I saw lights, torches, maybe 20 or 30 of them, arranged in a circle in what appeared to be a clearing. Figures moved between the flames, their shadows dancing grotesquely against the tree line behind them. I crept closer, using the corn stubble as minimal cover until I could see the gathering clearly. The entire town, it seemed, had assembled in that field. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothes that looked decades out of date. Simple farming attire that would have been common in the 1930s or 40s. They stood in concentric circles around something at the center, something I couldn't quite make out from my position. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a single voice. A man, elderly, his words carrying clearly across the field despite the distance. "The harvest demands its price," he called out. "As it was in the beginning, as it shall be, until the ending. The land gives, and we must give in return. The covenant must be honored." If you're feeling that creeping unease right now, that sense that something fundamentally wrong is happening, leave a comment below about the strangest tradition you've encountered in a small town. And make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take a turn that still keeps me awake at night. The crowd parted, creating a pathway to the center of the circle, and I finally saw what they'd gathered around. A pole, maybe 10 feet tall, driven deep into the earth, and tied to that pole, barely visible in the flickering torchlight, was a person. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, some kind of harvest effigy, but then it moved, and I realized with a horror that turned my blood to ice that it was alive. A woman, young, maybe early 20s, dressed in a simple white dress that glowed almost supernaturally in the firelight. Her head hung forward, dark hair obscuring her face, but I could see her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She was gagged, her hands bound behind the pole. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, sprint back to my car, and drive until I reached civilization. Instead, I raised my camera and started shooting. The journalist in me, the documentarian, had taken over completely. This was evidence of a crime, of something unspeakable happening in modern America. I had to capture it. The elderly man produced a knife from his belt, long and curved, its blade catching the torchlight. The crowd singing resumed. Louder now, that discordant melody that seemed to resonate in my bones, making my teeth ache. He approached the woman slowly, ceremonially, raising the blade above his head. That's when my phone rang. I'd forgotten to silence it. The ringtone, some generic melody I'd never bothered to change, shattered the night with all the subtlety of a car alarm. The singing stopped instantly. Every head in that clearing turned in my direction. Dozens of faces, illuminated by torchlight, all looking directly at where I crouched in the stubble. I ran. I've never run faster in my life. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I heard shouting, the sound of pursuit. They were faster than me, these farmers who worked the land every day, whose bodies were conditioned by physical labor. They were gaining. I burst onto the main street, making for my car, my hands fumbling for my keys. The engine roared to life just as the first of them reached the street. I saw him in my rearview mirror, the elderly man with the knife, his face contorted with rage. Then I was moving, tires squealing, racing through the empty streets of Millbrook toward the highway beyond. I didn't stop driving until I reached a truck stop 50 miles away, where I sat in the parking lot, shaking, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I pulled out my camera, my hands still trembling, and reviewed the photos I'd taken. They were all there. The circle of torches, the crowd in their anachronistic clothing, the pole, the woman tied to it, the man with the knife. Undeniable evidence of something criminal, something evil happening in that small Missouri town. I went to the police the next morning, the state police, not the local county sheriff, because I had no idea how deep this corruption ran, how many officials might be complicit or compromised. I showed them everything, told them everything. 3 days later, a pair of detectives came to my hotel room in Springfield. They looked tired, frustrated. The investigation, they told me, had found nothing. Millbrook existed, certainly. They'd interviewed residents, including Beth from the diner, and an elderly man named Ezekiel, who served as the town's unofficial mayor. Everyone had been cooperative, friendly even. They'd searched the fields. No pole, no evidence of any gathering, no missing women matching my description. And my photos? The detectives showed them to me on a tablet. They were all there, every image I'd taken. But they showed nothing. Empty fields, shadows that might have been people or might have been trees, darkness and grain, and nothing conclusive, nothing that proved anything beyond that I'd been in a field at night with a camera. Mr. Chen, one of the detectives said, his tone gentle but firm, "Is it possible you were exhausted from your drive? That maybe you'd been awake for too long and your mind played tricks on you? These long drives through rural areas, the isolation, it can affect people." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab them and make them understand that I knew what I'd seen, that I wasn't crazy or confused or sleep deprived. But looking at those photos, at the nothing they showed, doubt crept in. Doubt is poison for certainty. It spreads, infects, corrupts. I returned to Seattle the following week. My editor rejected my story about Millbrook. No evidence, no corroboration, nothing publishable. I spent weeks trying to verify anything about that night. I searched for missing person reports in Missouri. I looked for any historical information about harvest rituals or unusual traditions in rural communities. I found nothing concrete, just whispers and rumors, the kind of folklore that every region has. Then, exactly 3 months after my visit to Millbrook, I received a package at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note on plain paper. You saw the harvest. You photographed the covenant. But the camera doesn't see what the land protects. Some things are older than law, older than civilization. We keep the old ways because the old ways keep us. Beth wanted you warned. Consider this your final warning. Forget Millbrook. Forget what you think you saw. Or next harvest, you'll understand what it means to feed the land. I plugged the USB drive into my computer. It contained a single video file, no metadata, no identifying information. When I played it, I saw myself in that cornfield, raising my camera, shooting photos. The angle was from behind me, as if someone had been standing just a few feet away the entire time, watching me watch them. The video continued as I ran, capturing my panic, my terror. It ended with a close-up of my car's license plate as I drove away. They'd been there, right behind me, close enough to touch, and I'd never known. Make sure you hit that like button if this story is sending chills down your spine. We're just getting started, and the next 3 towns make Millbrook look welcoming by comparison. These places exist in the gaps on your map, in the spaces between exits, and the people there have their own rules. Rules that don't care about the outside world or its laws. I never went back to Missouri. I never tried to investigate Millbrook again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that woman tied to the pole, her white dress glowing in the torchlight. I think about what might have happened to her after I ran. I think about the covenant, the harvest, the price the land demands. And I wonder how many other towns there are like Millbrook, hidden in plain sight, keeping their old ways in the darkness between interstates. That was 5 years ago. Last week, I received another package, another USB drive, another video. This one showed a different field, a different ceremony, a different person tied to a pole. But in the background, barely visible between 2 of the torch-bearing figures, I could see her. The woman from my photos, older now, but unmistakably the same person. She wasn't a victim. She was a participant, standing with the others, singing their discordant song. I still don't know what that means. I'm not sure I want to. The second story takes us to the Appalachian Mountains, to a town that technically doesn't exist on any official map, but where people still live, still work, and still die in ways that defy rational explanation. My name is Sarah Brennan, and I'm an investigative journalist specializing in economic injustice in forgotten American communities. What I found in a nameless hollow in West Virginia made me question whether some communities deserve to be forgotten. I'd been following a lead about disability fraud in old mining towns, places where black lung disease and industrial injuries had created generations dependent on government assistance. My source, a former mine safety inspector named Gerald Hawkins, had mentioned a settlement deep in the mountains where the entire adult population claimed disability benefits despite appearing to be in perfect health. It sounded like a story about systemic fraud, about people gaming a broken system. What it actually was something far worse. Gerald picked me up in Charleston in a truck that had seen better decades. He was nervous, constantly checking his mirrors, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked for the third time as we left the interstate behind, heading into increasingly remote terrain. These people, they don't like questions. They especially don't like outsiders asking questions. I assured him I'd done this kind of reporting before, that I knew how to handle hostile subjects, how to build rapport with suspicious communities. His laugh was bitter and entirely humorless. "Sarah, you don't understand. This isn't about them being suspicious of outsiders. This is about them actively, intentionally harming outsiders. I've been to that hollow exactly once, 15 years ago, on official business. I've had nightmares about it ever since. The only reason I'm taking you is because maybe if someone with a bigger platform sees what I saw, someone might finally do something about it." The paved road ended after an hour. Then, the gravel road ended. Then we were on dirt tracks that barely qualified as roads at all. The truck bouncing over ruts and rocks, branches scraping both sides. The forest pressed in claustrophobically, old growth trees that blocked out the afternoon sun, creating a premature twilight that made my eyes struggle to adjust. "They call it Harrow Hollow," Gerald said as we descended a particularly steep grade. "Or at least that's what it was called on mining company maps from the 20s. The coal seam here played out in the 30s. Company town died. Everyone was supposed to have left, but they didn't." "So it's squatters?" I asked, making notes on my recorder. "It's more complicated than that. The land technically belongs to a holding company that went bankrupt in 1963. Ownership got tangled up in legal proceedings that were never resolved. So legally, it's in limbo. And in that limbo, these people have built their own world with their own rules." The hollow revealed itself gradually as we descended. Shacks and trailers scattered without apparent order along a muddy creek, smoke rising from improvised chimneys, vehicles from every decade of the last 50 years in various states of decay. But what struck me immediately was the people. They were outside, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, all watching our truck descend into their domain. "Don't make eye contact," Gerald muttered. "Don't challenge anyone. Don't take any photos. Just let me do the talking." We parked in front of what appeared to be the largest structure, a 2-story building that might have once been a company store. A man emerged from the shadows of the porch, moving with a peculiar shuffling gait that suggested serious joint problems. He was maybe 40, but looked 60, his face deeply lined, his body bent at odd angles. "Gerald," the man said, his voice a rasping whisper. "Been a long time. Heard you were coming. Heard you brought someone new. This is Sarah. She's a journalist. She's writing about economic challenges in former mining communities. I thought you folks might want to share your stories." The man's eyes moved to me, and I had to suppress a shiver. There was intelligence there, sharp and cold and evaluating. This was not a simple rural laborer. This was someone calculating probabilities, assessing threats, making decisions. "Journalist," he repeated, drawing the word out. We don't usually talk to journalists. Bad things happen when we talk to journalists. Last time we talked to a journalist, State came in asking questions about our children's schooling. Tried to take some kids away. We don't forget things like that. If you're wondering whether I should have left right then, whether some instinct should have told me to run, hit that subscribe button and keep watching. Because sometimes the worst decisions come from the best intentions, and I was about to make a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm not here to cause trouble, I said, keeping my voice even, respectful. I just want to understand how communities like yours survive when the economy that supported them disappears. Your stories matter. Your experiences matter. The man studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You can talk to people. You can ask your questions. But you have to understand our rules. You have to participate in our way of life. Tonight, we have a gathering. You'll come. You'll see what we do, and then you'll decide whether you still want to tell our story. Gerald tensed beside me, his hand moving toward my elbow as if to lead me back to the truck. But I was already nodding, already agreeing. This was the breakthrough every journalist dreams of. Acceptance into a closed community. A chance to see behind the curtain. My professional ambition overrode every warning sign, every instinct telling me something was fundamentally wrong here. The afternoon passed in a series of interviews that ranged from mundane to disturbing. Everyone I spoke with had the same shuffling gait, the same bent posture, the same appearance of severe disability. Everyone received government assistance, but when I asked about their daily activities, about how they managed despite their conditions, the stories didn't add up. One man who claimed total disability from a back injury had recently, according to his wife's casual mention, helped fell and process a massive oak tree. A woman who supposedly couldn't walk without a cane had apparently hiked to a neighboring hollow just last week to visit relatives. You're wondering about the disabilities, said the first man, whose name I'd learned was Thomas. He'd appeared beside me silently as I was packing up my recording equipment. You're thinking maybe we're exaggerating. Maybe we're scamming the system. I'm trying to understand the disconnect between what you're claiming and what I'm observing, I said carefully. His smile was unsettling, revealing too many gaps where teeth should have been. You'll understand tonight. At the gathering, we'll show you exactly what our disabilities are, exactly what this place has done to us, exactly what we've had to become to survive here. Dusk fell with unnatural speed in the hollow, the surrounding mountains blocking out the sun and plunging everything into deep shadow. Lights began appearing in windows, but they weren't electric lights. Candles, oil lamps, firelight. Gerald pulled me aside as people began moving toward the largest building. We can still leave, he hissed. Right now. Get in the truck and go. And abandon the story? This is exactly what I came for. Sarah, 15 years ago, they showed me things I still can't explain. Things that made me quit my job and spend the next 5 years in therapy. Please, trust me on this. Whatever they're going to show you tonight, you don't want to see it. But I did want to see it. That was the problem. Curiosity, that poisonous gift of journalism, had its hooks in me completely. I pulled away from Gerald and followed the crowd into the building. The interior had been cleared of furniture, creating a single large space lit by dozens of candles. The entire community was there, maybe 80 people, arranged in rows facing a raised platform at the far end. Thomas stood on the platform, his bent posture somehow more pronounced in the candlelight. "We welcome our guests," he announced, his rasping voice carrying clearly through the space. "They've come to see how we live, to understand our community. So tonight, we'll show them the truth. We'll show them the real reason we receive disability. We'll show them what the mountain gave us in exchange for our labor, our blood, our loyalty." The crowd began to undress, not sexually, not suggestively, but methodically, clinically, removing their clothing until they stood in the candlelight wearing only undergarments. And that's when I saw it. That's when I understood why Gerald had tried to stop me, why his warnings had been so urgent. Their bodies were wrong, not disabled in any conventional sense, wrong in ways that defied anatomy, that violated the basic structure of human physiology. Extra joints that bent in impossible directions, limbs that ended in too many or too few fingers, skin that seemed to ripple and shift as if something moved beneath it. One woman's ribcage was exposed, visible through skin that had become translucent, and I could see her organs pulsing, could count the beats of her heart. "The mine took our health," Thomas said, beginning to remove his own clothing. "Black lung, collapsed tunnels, toxic exposure. We were dying, all of us. The company left us here to die, so we made a different choice. We found a different way." His shirt came off, revealing a torso that made me gag, that made my mind struggle to process what my eyes were showing it. His spine protruded at odd angles, breaking through the skin in places, creating ridge-like structures that looked almost like armor plating. When he moved, I could see the individual vertebrae shifting, realigning, changing their configuration. "There are old places in these mountains," he continued, "places older than the coal, older than the trees, places where the rock remembers things from before humans, from when the world was different. We found one of those places, deep in the abandoned mine, and we drank from the water there, and it changed us. It gave us disabilities that qualified us for support, but it also gave us strength, gave us durability, gave us life when we should have died." The crowd began to move, and watching them in their transformed state was like watching a nightmare given flesh. They didn't walk so much as undulate, their altered joints allowing movements that seemed fluid and boneless. Some crawled on the walls, their fingers having transformed into something that could grip stone. Others' movements were jerking and insectoid, their limbs bending at angles that suggested entirely different skeletal structures. I don't remember backing toward the door. I don't remember Gerald grabbing my arm and pulling me outside. My mind had shut down, unable to process what I'd witnessed, unable to reconcile these transformations with any understanding of biology or medicine or reality itself. We ran to the truck. Gerald's hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. Behind us, the building's door opened, and they emerged, still in their altered forms, still moving in those reality-defying ways. They didn't chase us. They simply watched as we fled up the dirt track, the truck's headlights barely cutting through the darkness. I reported it. Of course I reported it. I went to state authorities, federal agencies, anyone who would listen. I showed them my recordings, played the audio where Thomas described their transformation. I begged them to investigate. to send someone with medical expertise, with scientific equipment. 2 months later, a team did go to Harrow Hollow. State social workers, a doctor, a representative from the disability office. They found a poor but ordinary community. People with legitimate disabilities from a lifetime of hard labor and mining exposure. Some scoliosis, some joint degradation, some respiratory issues. Nothing unusual, nothing impossible. Everyone was cooperative. Everyone's paperwork was in order. The lead investigator called me personally to express concern about my mental health, to suggest that maybe the stress of my work was causing me to imagine things, to embellish normal poverty into something monstrous. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, Gerald knows what he saw 15 years apart. We witnessed the same impossibility. Sometimes late at night, I search medical databases, looking for any condition that could explain those transformations. Genetic disorders, chemical exposure, radiation poisoning, anything that might make it make sense. I find nothing because there is nothing. No explanation exists within our understanding of human biology. Last year, I received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single sentence in handwriting I didn't recognize. The mountain provides, but the mountain demands. Thank you for not bringing those who would take what we've been given. I still don't know what that means. I'm terrified I might find out. Hit that like button if you're feeling that existential dread, that sense that reality is thinner than we assume, that human bodies are more malleable than we want to believe. Because we're only halfway through, and the next 2 towns will challenge everything you think you understand about rural America, about isolation, about what happens when communities decide they're not bound by the rules that govern the rest of us. The third story comes from Iowa, from a town so aggressively normal-looking that its horror is almost invisible until you've been there long enough for the mask to slip. My name is Jennifer Hartley, and 6 months ago, my husband David and I bought our dream house in a place called Prosperity. The real estate listing described it as a charming agricultural community with strong family values and low crime. They weren't lying exactly, but they weren't telling the truth either. We'd been looking for a change, David and I. Both of us worked remote tech jobs, and the San Francisco housing market had become unsustainable. When we found a fully renovated 4-bedroom farmhouse in Prosperity for less than a quarter of what we'd paid in rent annually, it seemed too good to be true. We should have listened to that instinct. The town looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Tree-lined streets, white churches with tall steeples, a downtown square with actual mom and pop businesses instead of chain stores. People waved as we drove through on our first visit. The realtor, a pleasant woman named Carol, couldn't stop praising the community spirit, the way neighbors looked out for each other, the safety and security of small-town life. "You'll love it here," she promised as she showed us the house. Everyone does. Once you're part of Prosperity, you never want to leave. The phrasing should have registered. Once you're part of Prosperity, not once you move to Prosperity. Part of. But we were so excited, so ready for our new adventure, that we signed the papers without a second thought. The first month was pleasant. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, welcomed us with genuine-seeming warmth. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but in a friendly, gossipy way, rather than a threatening way. David started working on the yard, planning a garden. I set up my home office in the sunroom. We attended a town barbecue and a church social. meeting dozens of families who all seemed perfectly nice and normal. Then came the invitation. It arrived in our mailbox, handwritten on cream-colored cardstock with a wax seal, like something from another century. The Hartley family is cordially invited to participate in the prosperity planting ceremony. Attendance is expected. Dress in your finest Sunday attire. Tuesday evening at dusk. The community field. What's the planting ceremony? David asked Carol when we saw her at the grocery store. Her smile never wavered, but something in her eyes changed, hardened. It's tradition. Every spring. The whole town participates. It's really quite beautiful. You'll love it. But what is it? What do we do? You plant, of course. That's what we do in prosperity. We plant, and we harvest, and we share the bounty. You'll understand Tuesday. Tuesday arrived with perfect spring weather. Warm, but not hot. A gentle breeze carrying the scent of apple blossoms. David and I dressed carefully. Him in a suit he rarely wore. Me in a dress I'd bought for a wedding years ago. Other families were walking toward the edge of town, all dressed similarly, all carrying something I couldn't quite make out from a distance. The community field was about a mile from our house, a large cleared area that bordered the cornfields that stretched for miles beyond town. The entire population of Prosperity was there, maybe 500 people, arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform where several town elders stood. In front of the platform stood a table covered in a white cloth, and on that table were dozens of small clay pots. "Welcome," said an elderly man I recognized as Pastor Deacon, though I'd later learn he hadn't been a real pastor for 30 years. "We gather, as we have gathered for generations, to ensure prosperity remains prosperous, to honor the covenant our founders made with this land, to bind ourselves to each other and to the earth that sustains us." The crowd responded in unison, a phrase I didn't catch, something that sounded Latin, or maybe older. "New families," Pastor Deacon continued, his eyes finding David and me in the crowd. "Step forward." We weren't the only newcomers. 2 other couples and a single man also stepped forward, all of us exchanging confused glances. Pastor Deacon handed each couple and the single man a clay pot. Inside was soil and a seed, though what kind of seed I couldn't identify. "You will each plant your seed in the community field," he instructed. "You will tend it as it grows, and when harvest comes, you will reap what you have sown. This is how we survive. This is how we thrive. This is the price of prosperity." It seemed harmless, even charming in a folkloric way. Each couple was assigned a spot in the field, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, already cleared and prepared. David dug the hole while I held the pot. We planted the seed, watered it from a communal bucket, and stepped back. The ceremony continued with prayers and more chanting in that unidentifiable language. Then everyone walked back to town, and we were invited to a community dinner where the conversation was about weather and crop yields and entirely mundane topics. "That wasn't so bad," David said as we walked home that night. "Kinda nice, actually. Community agricultural project. Very wholesome." I agreed, but something nagged at me. Something about the way the other long-term residents had looked at us during the ceremony. Not welcoming exactly, more like pitying, or perhaps anticipating. Make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on. Because what happened next, what we discovered growing in that field, is something that still makes me question whether we ever actually left prosperity, or whether some part of us is still there, still trapped, still tending our plot. Our seed sprouted within 3 days, which seemed fast, but not impossible. By the end of the week, it was already 6 inches tall, with leaves that were an unusual deep purple color. David, who developed an interest in botany since we'd moved, couldn't identify the species. He photographed it, planned to post in online plant identification groups, but our internet had been intermittent since we'd arrived, and he never got around to it. By week 2, the plant was 3 feet tall and beginning to produce what looked like fruit. Small, round, dark red, almost black. They grew directly from the main stalk rather than on branches, pulsing slightly as if filled with liquid. Other newcomers' plants looked similar, I noticed when I walked past the community field. But the long-term residents' plots grew different things, stranger things. One had vines covered in flowers that looked disturbingly like human hands. Another had stalks that seemed to move independently, tracking the sun with deliberate, almost intelligent movements. "We should ask someone what we're growing," I suggested to David one evening. "This doesn't look like any crop I've ever seen." He agreed, but whenever we tried to broach the subject with neighbors, the conversation would shift quickly to other topics. People were friendly about it, not hostile, but clearly uncomfortable discussing the community field and what grew there. Then came the first harvest. The town gathered again at dusk. Pastor Deacon stood on the platform with a large wicker basket. One by one, families approached their plots and harvested whatever had grown there. The couple who'd planted next to us picked their fruit first. It required some effort. The fruits didn't want to detach, clinging to the stalk with what looked like tendrils. When they finally came free, they bled, dark liquid that looked distressingly like blood running down the harvester's hands. "Your turn," Carol said, appearing beside us with a basket. "Harvest carefully. Take only what's ripe. Leave the rest for next time." David reached for one of the fruits on our plant. The moment his fingers touched it, the entire plant shuddered, and I heard something, a sound like a sigh or a sob, barely audible but definitely there. He jerked his hand back, looking at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Harvest," Pastor Deacon called from the platform, his voice sharp with command. "All newcomers must complete their first harvest." The crowd had grown silent, watching us, waiting. I saw the anticipation in their faces again, that same expression from the planting ceremony. They knew something we didn't. They were waiting to see our reaction to whatever we were about to discover. David set his jaw, reached out, and grasped the nearest fruit firmly. It came away with a wet tearing sound, and that noise again, louder this time, unmistakably a sound of pain. He dropped it into the basket, his hands now covered in the dark liquid. Up close, the smell was copper and iron, blood. We were harvesting something that bled. We filled our basket with a dozen of the fruits. Each one produced that terrible sound. Each one bled. By the time we finished, both of us were shaking, covered in the dark liquid, fighting the urge to vomit or scream, or both. "Excellent first harvest," Pastor Deacon said, examining our basket. "These will provide well. You'll see. You'll understand." The community dinner that followed was held in the town hall. Long tables laden with food, normal-looking food, casseroles and roasts and vegetable dishes. But I couldn't eat. Neither could David. Neither could any of the other newcomers. We sat together at one end of a table, exchanging horrified looks, while the long-term residents ate and chatted, as if everything was perfectly normal. "What are we eating?" I finally asked Carol, who was sitting across from me with a plate piled high. "The harvest," she said simply. "The fruits of our labor, the bounty of prosperity." "But what are they? What did we grow?" She set down her fork and looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy. "They're sustenance. They're what keeps prosperity prosperous. They're what ensures our crops never fail, our children stay healthy, our economy remains stable even when surrounding towns collapse. They're the price we pay and the reward we receive." "I don't understand." "You will. Give it time. Eat. You'll see the benefits soon enough. And next planting season, you'll understand why we do this, why we've always done this, why we'll continue doing it." We left the dinner early, went home, and immediately started researching moving companies. We'd made a mistake. This town was wrong. Whatever was happening with the community field, whatever those plants really were, we wanted no part of it. But our house wouldn't sell. Every realtor we contacted said the same thing. The market in Prosperity was non-existent. Houses rarely came available because people never left. We could rent it out, they suggested, but we couldn't sell. Not without taking a massive loss, not without waiting years for a buyer. We were trapped. Not physically, we could have just left, abandoned the house and our equity. But we were trapped by economics, by the reality that we'd invested everything in this property, that walking away would mean financial ruin. "1 year," David said. "We give it 1 year. We save money, and then we leave no matter what the financial cost." That was 4 months ago. Since then, things have changed. David noticed it first, how much better he felt. His chronic back pain, something he'd lived with since a car accident in college, disappeared completely. My migraines, which had plagued me since adolescence, vanished. We had more energy, slept better, felt healthier than we had in years, and our crops never failed. The garden David planted produced vegetables of unnatural size and abundance. Tomatoes the size of softballs, cucumbers that seemed to grow overnight. Everything we planted thrived with minimal effort. "It's the soil," Carol explained when I commented on our garden success. "The community field enriches the entire area. What you plant there feeds back into the land. It's symbiotic, beneficial." Next month is the second planting ceremony. Our invitation arrived yesterday, and this time I noticed something I'd missed before. The wax seal on the envelope, I'd assumed it was decorative, some kind of town logo. But looking closer, I realized it was a symbol, complex and geometric, the same symbol I'd seen carved into the tree at the edge of the community field, the same symbol I'd glimpsed in Pastor Deacon's study when David and I had visited to ask about the town's history. I looked it up online, using every search engine and symbol database I could find. Finally, I found a reference in an academic paper about pre-colonial American agriculture. The symbol appeared in indigenous legends, associated with spirits that demanded tribute, entities that granted abundance in exchange for sacrifice. The paper called it the Mark of the Harvest Lord, a being that existed in the boundary between Earth and something else, something older. I showed David. He stared at the screen for a long time, his face pale. "We're not planting again," he said finally. "We'll refuse. They can't force us." But can they? We don't know. Because no one refuses in prosperity. No one says no. Everyone participates, generation after generation, planting and harvesting and feeding whatever lives beneath that field, whatever entity made a deal with the founders of this town centuries ago. Our next-door neighbors stopped by this morning, friendly, smiling, bringing fresh baked bread. "Looking forward to the ceremony?" they asked. We didn't answer. They didn't seem to expect us to. "You know," the husband said as they were leaving, "people used to try to leave. In the early days, after the first harvest, they'd pack up, drive away. But funny thing, they always came back, sometimes within days, sometimes years later. But they always came back. Prosperity has a way of holding on to its own." The door closed behind them, and David and I stood in our beautiful farmhouse, in our dream home, in our nightmare town, and we realized something terrible. We'd already eaten from the community dinner. We'd already consumed whatever grew in that field. It was already in us, changing us, binding us to this place. We could leave. Physically, we could pack the car right now and drive away. But would we? Or would prosperity pull us back the way it had pulled back every other person who'd ever tried to escape? I'm writing this as a warning. If you're looking at real estate in small agricultural towns, if you find a deal that seems too good to be true, if everyone is just a little too friendly and welcoming, pay attention. Ask about their traditions. Ask about community gatherings, and if anyone mentions a planting ceremony, run, drive away, and don't look back. Because once you plant that seed, once you harvest that crop, once you eat from that field, you're part of prosperity, and prosperity never lets go. If this story is making you reconsider that move to a charming small town, hit that like button and drop a comment about the strangest local tradition you've encountered. We've got one more story, and it's the one that disturbs me most, because unlike the others, this one might still be recruiting. The final story takes us to coastal Maine, to a fishing village that exists on maps, but that GPS systems seem unable to locate reliably. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I'm an anthropology professor specializing in isolated communities and cultural preservation. What I documented in a place called Harrow's Point made me question whether some cultures should be preserved or whether some traditions are better left to die quietly in the darkness where they've always lived. I'd received a grant to study traditional fishing communities in New England, particularly those that had maintained pre-industrial practices. Harrow's Point came to my attention through a footnote in a maritime history book from 1923. The author mentioned a village where fishing techniques hadn't changed in over 2 centuries, where boats were still built using methods from the 17th century, where the community remained essentially unchanged despite the modern world's encroachment. It took me 3 days to find it. The roads weren't marked on any map I could find, digital or paper. GPS directions led me in circles. I finally had to stop at a tackle shop 40 miles south and ask the proprietor, an elderly man who looked at me with something like pity when I mentioned my destination. "Harrow's Point," he repeated slowly. "You sure you want to go there, son?" "I'm a researcher. I study traditional communities." "They're traditional, all right. Traditional in ways you probably don't want to understand. My daddy used to tell stories about that place. Said they made deals with things in the deep water. Said they brought up catches that weren't fish. Said their boats always came back, even in storms that sank everyone else. I thanked him for the directions he reluctantly provided and drove north along the coast until I found the unmarked turnoff he'd described. The road descended sharply, winding through dense pine forest that blocked out the afternoon sun. The temperature dropped noticeably as I approached sea level, and a fog rolled in, thick and unnatural, smelling of salt and something else, something organic and rotting. Harrow's Point revealed itself suddenly, the fog parting just enough to show a harbor with perhaps 24 boats, all wooden, all clearly hand-built, all identical in design despite presumably being different ages. Houses clustered around the harbor, gray weathered structures that looked like they'd grown from the rock rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from chimneys despite the relative warmth of the early autumn day. I parked near the harbor and approached the nearest building, which appeared to be a combination general store and harbormaster's office. A bell jangled as I entered, and a woman emerged from the back room. She was young, maybe late 20s, but her eyes had the weariness of someone much older. Those eyes assessed me with uncomfortable intensity, like a predator evaluating potential prey. "Researcher," she said, before I could introduce myself. "We were told you were coming. How could you know that?" Her smile was unsettling, not reaching her eyes. "The tide tells us things. The deep water whispers. You're Dr. Webb. You want to study our traditions. You want to document our ways before they disappear." "Yes, that's exactly right. I have grant funding for a 3-month ethnographic study. I was hoping to arrange housing and interview subjects. You can stay in the visitor's house. We keep it for the occasional outsider. As for interviews, you'll find people willing to talk. But you must follow our rules. You don't go on the water without permission. You don't enter homes unless invited. And when the tide turns, you stay indoors with shutters closed and doors locked. No exceptions, no questions." I agreed, too excited by the access to question the strange restrictions. The visitor's house was a small cottage at the edge of the village, sparsely furnished, but clean. That first night, I reviewed my research plan and prepared my interview questions, too focused on my work to notice the silence. The absolute, complete silence. No birds, no insects, just the sound of waves against rock and occasionally something else. A low sound, almost subsonic, that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. The interviews began the next morning. Everyone was willing to talk, even eager, but their stories were disjointed, contradictory, circling around truths they couldn't or wouldn't speak directly. The oldest resident, a man named Caleb, who claimed to be 96 but looked 70, described fishing techniques that made no sense. "We don't use bait," he said. "Don't need it. The catch comes to us. Always has. We put out the nets, we sing the old songs, and they come. Fill the nets so full sometimes we can barely haul them in." "What songs?" I asked, my recorder running. He sang something in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not French, not any indigenous language I was familiar with. The syllables were strange, difficult for human vocal cords to produce, clicking and whistling and resonating in ways that made my teeth ache. When he finished, the sound lingered in the air, seeming to echo from the walls and floor and ceiling. "That's the calling song," he said. "Brings them up from the deep places. They like the sound. It reminds them of the old times, before the land, before the air, when everything was water and darkness. Them? I asked. You mean the fish? His expression changed, becoming pitying, the way an adult might look at a child who doesn't understand something fundamental about the world. Sure, the fish. That's what we call them. Similar evasions happened in every interview. People would start to explain something, then catch themselves, rephrase, speak in metaphors and euphemisms. I grew frustrated, feeling like I was missing the actual story, like everyone was performing a script for my benefit while the truth remained hidden. Then came the night the tide turned. I was working late in the visitor's house, transcribing interviews, when I heard it. A sound like a horn, deep and resonant, coming from the harbor. I went to the window and saw people emerging from their houses, all moving toward the docks, all carrying lanterns, all silent despite the numbers. The fog had rolled in thick, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet. I grabbed my camera and recorder and followed, remembering the woman's warning, but too caught up in the moment to care. This was clearly some kind of ritual, exactly the type of traditional practice I was here to document. I moved carefully through the fog, following the lights toward the harbor. The entire village had gathered on the main dock. They stood in rows, the lanterns creating a pathway of light that extended out over the water. At the end of the dock stood 3 figures I recognized as the village elders. They were singing that same strange song Caleb had taught me, but in harmony, 3-part, and the effect was overwhelming, disorienting, making the air itself seem to vibrate. The water began to glow. At first, I thought it was bioluminescence, phytoplankton disturbed by the singing's vibrations. But the light was wrong, too structured, too intentional. It formed patterns beneath the surface, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could properly process. Something was rising. I saw it break the surface, maybe 50 yards from the dock. Large, far larger than any fish, larger than any whale. The fog made it impossible to see clearly, but I got impressions. Too many limbs, movement that didn't match any sea creature I knew, and eyes, multiple eyes, glowing with that same unnatural light, fixing on the gathered villagers with obvious intelligence. The singing intensified. The villagers swayed in unison, a movement that looked almost like dancing but more rhythmic, more ritualistic. And the thing in the water responded, moving closer, its limbs, tentacles, appendages, whatever they were, reaching toward the dock. I raised my camera and started shooting, the flash cutting through the fog in brief stuttering bursts. That's when the creature saw me. Its attention shifted with terrifying speed, all those eyes focusing on me simultaneously. The singing stopped. Every villager turned, and I saw their expressions transform from reverent concentration to shock and anger. "No outsiders!" someone shouted. "The rule, no outsiders when the tide turns." The creature made a sound, a vocalization that was definitely not anything produced by any animal I could name. It sounded curious, questioning, and underneath that, hungry, appallingly, terrifyingly hungry. I ran. Behind me, I heard the villagers scrambling, heard that horn sound again, heard the creature moving through the water, faster than something that large should have been able to move. The fog seemed to thicken deliberately, trying to confuse me, turn me around, send me toward the water instead of away from it. I reached the visitor's house and slammed the door, throwing every lock, pulling every shutter closed as the woman had instructed. Outside, I heard movement. Wet, sliding, something massive moving between the buildings, searching. The scratching started on the walls, not aggressive, more exploratory, curious, testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. I huddled in the center of the room, holding my camera like a talisman. The images I'd captured proof that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. The scratching continued for hours, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the roof. Once, something pressed against the shuttered window with enough force to make the wood creak and bow. I heard that vocalization again, muffled by the walls, but still clear enough to make my entire body vibrate with sympathetic resonance. Dawn came eventually. The sounds stopped. I waited until full sunlight before opening the shutters, before unlocking the door. The village looked normal in daylight. People moved about their business. Boats prepared to head out for the day's fishing. Everything appeared utterly ordinary, except for the marks on the visitor's house. Deep gouges in the wood, patterns of scratches that suggested multiple limbs, multiple appendages, something that could grip in ways that defied standard biology. The woman from the store was waiting outside. "You were warned," she said, her voice tired rather than angry. "Rules exist for reasons. The tide turns and they come. They come because we call them. They come because we made a bargain 300 years ago. We call, they answer, and they fill our nets. But they're curious about outsiders. They want to understand. They want to taste. If you hadn't locked yourself inside, they would have taken you down to their city, shown you things humans aren't meant to see, changed you into something that could live in those depths with them." "What are they?" I managed to ask through my fear. "Old, older than whales, older than fish. They were here when this land was still underwater, millions of years ago. And they'll be here long after the ice melts and the oceans reclaim the shore. We feed them songs and ceremony. They feed us fish and protection. It's simple. It works. It's kept Harrow's Point alive when every other fishing village on this coast has died. This is insane. This is impossible. Then leave. Take your research and go. But know this, Dr. Webb, you photographed them. You saw them clearly. That creates a connection. They know you now. They're interested in you, and they're very patient. They can wait. The ocean always waits." I did leave. That day, I threw everything in my car and drove away from Harrow's Point as fast as legally possible. I went straight to my university, to my department head, showed him the photos on my camera. They were all black, every single image. Not corrupted, not failed, just black, as if I'd been photographing in absolute darkness despite the lanterns, despite the glowing water, despite everything I'd witnessed. "Exposure malfunction," my department head said. "Happens sometimes. Shame about the loss. But you can go back. Get more images." I couldn't explain why I wouldn't go back. I couldn't make him understand what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what had scratched on the walls of that house all night. He thought I'd had a breakdown, that the isolation and cultural immersion had triggered some kind of psychotic episode. I was encouraged to take a medical leave. That was 8 months ago. I haven't published any findings from Harrow's Point. I haven't returned to finish the study. My career is essentially over. But I'm alive. I'm still human, I haven't been taken down to whatever city exists in the deep water off that coast. Haven't been transformed into something that can survive in those crushing depths, in that absolute darkness. Sometimes though, usually at night, I hear it. That calling song, faint, as if carried across vast distance by water and wind, and I feel the pull, the curiosity, the invitation to return, to see what I only glimpsed, to understand what I only partially witnessed. I haven't gone back yet, but the ocean is patient, and Harrow's Point is still there, still calling, still making its bargains with things that swim in the spaces between known species and unknown horrors. If you're still watching, if you've made it through all 4 of these stories, make sure to smash that like button one final time. Drop a comment telling me whether you think these towns really exist, whether communities like this could survive in modern America, hidden in plain sight, following rules that predate our civilization. And subscribe, because the map of America has more blank spaces than you think, more towns that GPS can't find, more communities that have made accommodations with forces older and stranger than anything you learned about in school. These stories are true. The details have been changed to protect identities. Locations have been obscured. But the core experiences, the fundamental events, these happened. They're happening still, in towns you've driven through on road trips, in communities you've seen exit signs for, but never visited, in the spaces between cities where the old world and the old ways still persist. Be careful where you stop for gas. Be cautious about which back roads you take. And if you find yourself in a small town where everyone is just a little too friendly, where traditions seem a little too specific, where the locals warn you about certain times or certain places, listen to those warnings. Because some communities don't trust outsiders for very good reasons. Some places keep secrets because those secrets keep them alive. And some towns make bargains that can't be broken, with costs that must be paid in ways that modern law and modern morality have no jurisdiction over. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there. And remember, the next time someone tells you nothing ever happens, in small towns, they might be lying. Or they might be protecting you from truths you're not ready to understand. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next video. If the algorithm decides to recommend it, if the forces that govern visibility in the digital age allow this message to spread. Because sometimes certain stories don't want to be told. Certain truths fight back against exposure. And certain warnings get suppressed by powers we don't fully understand and can't effectively resist.